December 7th, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy. December 8th, the day America declares war on Japan and enters World War II. Both of these days will remain among the most significant in America's history. America's entrance into World War II marked the end of their attempts to remain isolated. This meant it was time to gather troops and begin training. While the men who joined the army and fought to defend our country were extremely brave and influential, they could not have been successful by themselves. An extremely important aspect of World War II was life on the home front. Civilians gathered together to fight against the enemy and strive to reach a common goal. Through propaganda, rationing, and many other factors, civilians on the home front contributed greatly to the World War II effort. A major factor that encouraged millions to join the war effort was propaganda posters. These posters advertised the many different things that you could do to contribute to the war. A common figure seen on many posters was Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam, initials US, is a common national personification of the American government or the United States in general, that according to legend came into use during the War of 1812. Uncle Sam had been used in wars previous to World War II, encouraging men to join the U.S. Army. He represents a manifest of patriotic emotion. The first step to fighting in the war was to gather a large and powerful army. These posters encouraged men to enlist, telling them it was their duty to serve for their country. Many advertised the evils of Germany and Japan, persuading men even further, as well as causing Americans to come together against their common enemy. Another important figure seen on many propaganda posters was Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter, star of a government campaign aimed at recruiting female workers for the munitions industry, became perhaps the most iconic image of working women during the war. As men entered the army and left to fight overseas, women entered the workforce, contributing largely to the war effort. In fact, the percentage of female workers increased from 27 to 37%. By 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. The aircraft industry saw one of the largest influx of female workers. More than 310,000 women worked in the U.S. aircraft industry in 1943, making up 65% of the industry's total workforce, compared to just 1% in the pre-war years. Many women also worked in ammunition factories. Rosie the Riveter is one of the most successful recruitment figures and the most iconic image of working women during this era. She stressed the patriotic need for women to join the workforce and war effort. It was stressed that the harder a woman worked, the faster her father, husband, brother would come home. Considering America's extensive period of isolationism, we were not prepared to enter war. After declaring war, President Roosevelt set forward war production. He set large goals for the nation's factories. Companies already engaged in defense work expanded, and other factories changed dramatically, turning from production of goods to production of military supplies. With the large amount of war supplies America was generating, materials were limited. Citizens were asked to save and donate supplies and materials to the war effort, specifically rubber, tin, as well as others. Supplies were also limited due to the fact that America wasn't able to purchase many. For example, most rubber supplies came from Southeast Asia, which soon became occupied by the Japanese. Citizens were asked to turn in old tires, raincoats, gloves, garden hoses, and rubber shoes for recycling. As soon as the U.S. entered the war in the winter of 1941 to 1942, shortages of food and supplies began. Meat, sugar, coffee, canned foods, fuel, shoes, and other consumer goods were limited. In response, civilians had to ration their food and goods and were only allowed to buy small amounts of goods. The government introduced rationing because certain things were in short supply during the war, and rationing was the only way to make sure everyone got their fair share. 4 ration books and tokens were issued to each American family, dictating how much items any one person could buy. Every family was given a series of ration books, each containing stamps for certain ration items. Once your ration stamps were gone, you could not buy any more of that food. There were severe punishments if rationing rules were not followed, such as 10 years in prison or $10,000 fine. Other propaganda posters promoted carpooling and riding together to share gas and rubber tires. Many of these posters advertised the idea that Hitler was riding in any spare seats in a car, directly targeting Germany as the enemy and further uniting the American people against the enemy. In addition to the rationing that they received, civilians were encouraged to grow their own rations. With limited food supplies, as well as German U-boats sinking hundreds of ships carrying food, the practical way to contribute to the war effort was to grow a victory garden. Victory gardens became very popular, around 20 million being planted during this time. These gardens produced 40% of all vegetables, around 9 to 10 million tons. The Department of Agriculture produced pamphlets to guide urban and suburban gardeners. Magazines and newspapers published helpful articles, and patriotic posters urged participation. Special Victory Garden fertilizer was also supplied for home use. Victory gardens were promoted as family fun and good, healthy recreation. They increased morale while providing extra food. Another common contribution to the war effort was canning food at home. After growing their own food in victory gardens, civilians would can their produce. Getting folks to can at home was a way of relieving pressure on the canning industry that was needed to preserve food for soldiers. Canning brought the public together as a common need to support the troops. World War II was obviously a very expensive war for America. The federal government spent over $300 billion during World War II, twice as much during the war alone as it had spent in its entire existence before the war. Because of this, the U.S. needed money. FDR came up with a plan to increase taxes and borrow money through the sale of massive amounts of war bonds. The Revenue Act of 1942 expanded the number of people who were being taxed, increasing from 4 million to 42 million people. A war bond consists of debt securities issued by a government for the purpose of financing military operations during times of war. It is an emotional appeal to patriotic citizens to lend the government their money because these bonds offer a rate of return below the market rate. For example, you could purchase a $25 war bond for $18.75, and the government would use that money for any military supplies needed. 10 years after buying this war bond, you could redeem your war bond for $25. You can see the World War II effort was much more than just the fighting overseas. America's victory could not have been accomplished if it weren't for the courageous men in battle, as well as the hard-working civilians on the home front.